Welcome to Stories from the Standing Room. Join us for tales of history, phantoms, folklore, ghost stories, mysterious happenings, and more. A playful and fun weekly podcast with a
British husband and his American wife.
Join us from inside our 450-year-old home in the English countryside.
For journeys into the past, the arcane, and the downright spooky.
Welcome, everybody,
Hello.
to episode 16, husband.
16, there you go.
Can you believe it? We've been doing this for 16 weeks.
I'm not sure. Sometimes it seems longer than 16, sometimes it seems less.
Maybe for our listeners, it seems
It
really,
seems
really,
an eternity.
really long, 16,000 years. Well, we are here for episode 16, which we are going to talk about. I have an amazing story from a gal named Susie about the Hauncas. Have you ever heard about the Hauncas?
Not before you've mentioned it.
I know, I never heard the name Hauncas, but this is about the black dog or the wolf, the werewolves. So this is the Native American.
The Native American equivalent of what we were talking about a few weeks ago. We were talking about the Yeth Hound.
Yeth, the Earth Hound.
Yeah.
But I guess every culture kind of has this big black supernatural nighttime wolf.
They seem to.
So this is a great
I don't
story.
know all cultures, but many.
Yeah. Again, we can't say we have all the answers. This is just really just our knowledge up to this particular point and our opinion and our own personal experience. We do not claim to be experts. We are just husband and wife sitting around in the standing room telling ghost stories. Well, not just ghost stories, but stories of folklore and history.
Historic context. That kind of
Hauntings. We love time, ancient times. So that's our thing. Is you being a senior academic at the university, you love history as well as I love the medieval period. You love time. Our house is 450 years old.
Yep.
So we are here every week. We try to do this every week. It is a podcast of, well, little proportions now, but we're looking to grow. If you have a story, we ask that you please do submit your supernatural happening. It doesn't have to be a ghost. It could be
Just
really
something strange, unexplainable, mysterious, whatever.
Yeah, we could read it, or we will be taking your MP3s if you have a smartphone. Most people do these days. I don't know anybody who's still on rotary dial, but if you wanted to, if you are on rotary dial, you can send us an email and I can go ahead and read the story for you. Or you could send us an MP3, which is relatively easy. You know how to do that. You just go to the recording thing on your smartphone.
Yeah.
Then there's a little send option.
Yeah.
You can send that as an attachment to us on our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/stories from the standing room. Our website is www.storiesfromthestandingroom.com. We're also on Twitter at standingroomhrh. And gosh, we're also on Pinterest. We're all over the place. So
all over. Spread.
we're growing.
Margarine.
Like margarine?
Spread like
I've
margarine.
never heard you call it margarine.
Well, I couldn't think of anything like that.
You've always called it margarine.
Margarine.
Honey, I've never heard you say that.
Well, what else could I call it but margarine?
Butter.
Spready stuff.
You usually call, I guess you could call it olive spread.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've never heard you say margarine. We've been married a long time.
Yeah. I don't eat it much. In fact, I don't think margarine actually is legally can be sold any longer. It can't.
Why
Europe.
not?
Well, it's not. It's so bad for you.
Yeah,
it was
it is.
because when it was invented, it was created by Napoleon for two reasons. One, it was used for his troops could spread it onto bread. But what people don't also realise is when it was created to use as a kind of axle grease. It was used to use on wheels and cannons and things. So it had a dual purpose. And so there are things in it which aren't actually very good for you, never have been. And so I think maybe 20 years. I didn't realise that you couldn't buy it any longer, but margarine is no longer sold. It's not in the UK anyway. I don't know if it's sold in the States. Probably not.
It is sold in the States, I believe, still. I don't know. I mean, I wasn't checking the shelves for that when we were there last.
It's not one of the things you really go out and look for, is it?
But to grease the cannons and to feed your troops.
It has other properties that was used. That's why it was quite a kind of a very useful tool for the Napoleonic army.
See, the trivia and the facts you can learn by listening to Stories from the Standing Room.
Yeah, no things I forget until it comes out.
We start rolling. You do come up with some really amazing things. And I know you have some stories where we're going to continue the ghoulish graveyard stories. Yes?
Yeah, I'd got onto these horseshoes, but yes.
Well, wait a minute. You can't bait us like that without delivering.
The reason that Napoleon basically lost, because Napoleon is defeated the first time around because he's defeated, like the Germans, by the Russian weather. One of the reasons was they couldn't move quick enough when the snow came in because they hadn't got snow horseshoes for their horses. They got summer horseshoes and they hadn't got the right horseshoes.
I had no idea there were even summer and winter horseshoes.
Yeah, so some are for ice and some are not for ice. Some are
So
for
it's not
mud.
fashion, it's function.
No, it's function. It's about gripping the ice. And so the horses are slower at moving.
I had no idea.
At that point, when the ice started to come in, it was not a great expert on this, but I know it was did relate to the nature of the horseshoes, because it sounds silly, but your horse can move twice as quickly if it's got a gripping horseshoe.
Well, I had no idea,
And
honey.
that's why they were slowed. They were slowed. The campaign was then slowed down. The winter set in, and they just then had to retreat slowly, and then it killed off half the army.
Well, see, all the stuff that you learn when you're listening to Stories from the Standing Room?
But that's what I seem to remember. It was because of the nature of the horseshoes which had been supplied.
We'll have to look that up.
And I hadn't got enough blacksmiths to rehorse the shoes.
You need a boatload of them, a schload.
Yeah, there were loads. Another day we can do Napoleon. We can do a whole load of ghosts in Napoleonic Wars.
There are some horrific things that I remember about Napoleon. Just really quick about a love letter he wrote to Josephine that is gross enough to pretty much horrify everybody. But that's for another show.
That's right. Let's get to the
Okay, never mind. Yeah,
and
it's
the stories we have and the continuing last week's stories of gruesome graveyards.
yes, we were talking about mausoleums, and tell me what you've got in store for us this week.
Well, I had mentioned the Paris Catacombs. I don't really have a particular ghost story, but I was just going to touch on the Paris Catacombs. And then I'm also going to talk about the moving coffins
Yes.
of Christchurch, Barbados.
Ooh.
Over a number of years, one crypt or mausoleum in Barbados, early 19th century, over a number of years, that the coffins were moving in a particular mausoleum. So
Are they moving themselves?
absolutely, that's the core to the story. Well, they are
minute,
until they
yes.
are propelled at high speed across the mausoleum. And that's the story itself.
Dear God.
So
Really?
and it's something that is not happening in kind of folk lore, and it's being recorded by the authorities, and the authorities are actually involved in checking what this phenomenon is. So it's quite interesting because there were actual checks into what was happening. So this is what makes that story particularly gruesome and particularly interesting.
Do you want to start off with the Christchurch? Let's do that.
Okay, I could start with
Yeah.
that one. What happens is that a kind of high-grade fine tomb was built for the Honourable James Eliot, who was living on the island in the late 18th century. And he creates this tomb with mausoleum, which is actually cut into the ground. So it's cut into rock. You can't enter this apart from the one entrance. And the entrance, it's like a cave, it's cut into the ground. You enter the entrance via the steps. And the steps is covered by this giant, very, very heavy piece of blue marble. And that it's said that this could be lifted only by a minimum of 8 very strong, fit men. It would normally be double that. It would take about 15 men to lift this piece of marble. It's not a mausoleum that you can just pop into and pop out of. So that's the core of this. It's very hard to get into this mausoleum. So this James Eliot, in 1792, his wife dies, Elizabeth. Elizabeth is buried. Now, several years later, he decided to sell the mausoleum in a way that you would sell a house. So I'm not quite sure why, but he sells the mausoleum to the Chase family. The mausoleum is opened, the great heavy slab is removed, and they go down to remove the body and the coffin of his wife, Elizabeth. When they go down, there's no body and no coffin.
Where she was buried, or
Yeah.
where she was placed in this
she was
mausoleum.
placed. At the point of the actual funeral, there were many people that saw that the body, it was in the coffin was in the tomb, and the tomb is sealed. You can't get to it any other way.
No one's going to mess with it. With that
Yeah,
big
exactly.
room, yeah.
Apart from this, through this set of stairs, which is covered by this very, very heavy piece of marble. So that's the first mystery.
Where was she moved to?
Well, she wasn't. She was gone. The coffin and the body was gone. It was never found. That was the first mystery associated to this tomb.
Okay.
It then lies empty, nothing happens. A few years later, the first Chase burial, which was in 1808, of baby Marianne. Now, Marianne was buried.
When you say buried, you mean placed in the mausoleum?
When I
Yes,
say buried,
okay.
so placed within the mausoleum under the ground. It's then capped with this solid piece of marble. And then we move on 4 years, in fact, until 1812, when her sister dies. And this then moves us on to afterwards, when the father also died. They start to note that something is happening and something is not right. Because when it was opened to place the father's coffin into the mausoleum, the two coffins of the two sisters have been literally thrown across the tomb. They were both damaged. They were sealed, they were still nailed, so they were in the wrong position totally. The other side of the mausoleum thrown across the floor of the crypt. This was not explained, but they were put back to where they should be, and the father's coffin was placed into it. Now, we must remember that the father's coffin is a very heavy 240-pound lead coffin.
Big one.
So that's a big one. Everything was tidied. 3 coffins were then put back in. The tomb was sealed.
Okay, can I ask a question here really quick? If it's sealed, no one can go visit the grave then? They just visit this big blue stone?
Yes, because in that type of mausoleum, they didn't go into the coffins. They would go onto the surface, and then they'd lay flowers onto the surface.
Where this stone is
and
at.
the big stone.
So no one's messing around with the graves, because it's like inside a grave site, I guess.
Yes, exactly. Okay. So this large piece of marble is also sealed. It's literally concreted in.
So it's like the door that you go to visit.
Yes.
It'd be like the tombstone, I guess.
Yes, it's like the tombstone.
Gotcha.
So they know that the coffins are underneath, and this large piece of very, very, very heavy marble is sealed in with concrete. Then 4 years later, their 11-year-old brother Charles dies. Now, he again is buried in the tomb, so the tomb is opened, and this time what they also see, apart from the usual throwing of the casket, is that the particularly heavy coffin of the father has been thrown very violently.
It's impossible.
Yeah, well, the thing is, to get a person or a group of people to throw that, you wouldn't be able to literally throw it. You'd have to use some kind of contraption or machine to propel something so heavy in a small space for the damage that was done. So it's not something that could be created by some kind of... There had also been no earthquakes. None of the other tombs through any of these occurrences have moved. So all the tombs around it, there's no water going in. There's no earthquakes reported, nothing that could move coffins even a few inches, and particularly not propel something so heavy across a relatively small space and damage it. The energy behind it was massive. We're having the movement of these coffins in the one tomb, but nowhere else.
Gotcha.
There's nothing that could be explained relating to earthquake or earth movement or anything.
The other graves in the graveyard,
yeah. And that would only explain a few inches and not the kind of movement that we're seeing. So we then move forward just a few months, and there was a family friend who was due to be buried, by which time news of these events was spreading around the island. So the governor of the island, Lord Connember, decided that before the tomb was opened again for this burial, the governor of the island decided to scientifically investigate this. The locals are becoming really quite scared by this. You can imagine that kind of, it's a slave economy. You have people taken from Africa, that there is the beginnings of what we would now know as voodoo happening. And so it's an island where it's inflammatory, it's a slave situation. And the governor is concerned that the people are really beginning to panic.
Right.
So he goes in and arranges that it's fully inspected and investigated before the slab is moved. So they investigate the setting of the slab, the concrete. The slab is then moved. So at this point, they're checking for footprints, etc.
Right.
And the usuals happened. Coffins have been thrown around, only even more violently. And one of them's broken open. One of the skeletons is actually hanging out.
That's creepy.
Yes, it's getting more and more violent.
Yeah.
If that's the right word, or more and more expressive, whatever. So it's becoming more and more pronounced down there. So what they do is they put the coffins back. So the governor's checked all the aspects that it's a completely sealed tomb. And what they also do are things like they do measurements. They exactly know where the coffins are.
Right.
And they put sand on the surface.
Ah, that's interesting. Yeah.
So if there was any tampering, you wouldn't be able to walk in or out without leaving footprints.
Clever.
Animal or human.
Yeah.
And then it's sealed. The governor even puts his own seal into the concrete. 2 years later, they check the seal and they check that it's completely air and watertight and everything is as it should be. However, strange and unnatural sounds have been heard emanating from the tomb. They open the tomb.
They're all
Half the
waiting.
island has turned up just to see what's happening. So the governor goes down. Yeah, well, he goes down with his
Okay.
his scientific investigators and the members of the family, the Chase family too. Now, interestingly, when they get to the bottom, they cannot open the door. One of the coffins has been hurled and thrown. He's upright against the door.
My God.
Now, it was said it would be physically impossible to close the door and then lean the coffin against the door. And there were independent, what we would call scientific witnesses brought in, who were there at the sealing. So they were able to confirm it was sealed, it remained sealed. At that point, all coffins were removed. It was not sealed and has never been used since.
Do we know what it was?
No.
Still to this day?
They took the coffins out and that was the end. Each coffin was then individually buried within the same churchyard, but buried in a normal grave. There was no activity reported around those graves later, and that tomb has never been used. So what happened, we don't know. It was just the ammunition for the tomb, the bodies, the coffins, whatever, had been removed, and it's never been used to this
Still
day.
a mystery to this day.
Yes.
That is a good story.
It is, and what's great about that story is it's evidence-based. We have the records of what was done to try and understand what was going on, and it just made it an even deeper mystery. Those drawings are certainly out there of the positions and each time the coffin moved. It's Christchurch, Barbados, and it's the Chase family vault. It's known as the Chase vault.
Well, what do you think it was?
I really don't know. But interestingly, just as a postscript to that, when they went in for the last check, when the coffin was against the door, the sand was in the same way it had been dropped. So no water would have changed the lay of the sand. I mean, water could not move these things at that force. They'd float and they'd go bibbly bobbly. No water was in. It was a completely dry, airtight environment.
And just this one family. Or
Just
this
the one family.
Perhaps it had to do with that particular plot of earth. Maybe.
Don't know.
We don't
Because there
know.
are lots of other burials around it. There's something about the illustrations which show where the coffins are, which is truly spooky.
Well, it's
Whatever
also
are
it's the
very
perfect
spooky.
ghost story. One, it's unsolved. Two, it's
Yes.
happening at night, and it's moving coffins inside a mausoleum.
Well, we don't know if it's happening at night. People were said to be walking through during the day and hearing unearthly sounds.
What were the unearthly sounds? Do we know?
Noises, wailing. I think they were described as unearthly and undescribable sounds emanating from the tomb.
High time creep factor. That's very, very good
Very
story.
screepy. Creepy.
Scary and creepy. Creepy.
Creepy.
Well,
Use
speaking of unearthly, I have a couple listener submissions that we have to get to, actually, because these are really beefy and they're relatively long. Are you ready
Yes, please.
to hear about the Hauncas?
Uh-huh.
I hope I'm saying this correctly. All right, here we go. Susie Anderson Taylor has submitted this story, and I had never heard. I mean, I've heard of werewolves, like everybody has. Right? Yeah, you too. Remember, we watched Being Human a long time ago.
Yeah,
Love
we love
that.
Being Human.
Everybody knows about werewolves, and vampires, and ghosts. But these are called the Hauncas, and they are spelled Hauncas. Susie writes. My father used to tell me a story of Native American creatures that would terrorize the Creek people in the deep, dark woods of Oakmulgee, Oklahoma. My father, being full-blooded Creek Indian, loved to tell a good, scary story, and as a child, I was always willing to listen. Every summer, I'd travel with my family to Oklahoma to my Grandma Marcia's little cottage. Her home was perfectly placed in the deep woods of Oakmulgee. To my memory, I had never seen woods so dark, and sitting around a campfire with all my Creek aunts and uncles and cousins, I got the feeling that their mission in life was to scare the crap out of this California half-breed. I guess it was sort of an initiation. So when I was 5 years old, I first heard the story of the Hauncas. That's pretty early. Little did they know that I savored every word. Now, the story would change ever so slightly over the years. My father was one for embellishing. So, sitting in a small clearing of the blackest of woods, my dad's face lit only by the campfire, I heard my first tale of the Hauncas. Now, please excuse me if I've not spelled the Creek name of this creature correctly, but in English, it's supposed to mean wolf with long ears, or just long ears. The story goes, as a child, my father was told of the legend of the Hauncas by his father, my grandfather. Apparently, my grandfather knew of a man named Danny, the name has changed occasionally, who suddenly passed away. Danny was a young man, so it was very odd and unexplained. His family had a notion that he had met his fate by way of the Hauncas. Now, this Hauncas has been described to me as an unusually large and dire wolf-like creature that would devour the dead. That's good, isn't it?
Yeah.
Creek family members would hire someone, a gunman, perhaps they were called, to watch over the deceased until the funeral. Back then, they would have a single room or shanty with one window and one door in which to keep the deceased body. The only window in the shack was a very high one, and for a reason, small. My dad told me this tiny window, depending on the shack, could be at least 10 to 12 feet up. Its purpose, so the gunman would know when the sun rose. Thus the Hauncas could then not break in and eat the deceased. One more reason this window was so small and high was to protect the gunman from locking eyes with the Hauncas. It was told that if one were to meet the gaze of this creature, it would steal your spirit, and then you would die within days. Thus more food for the hungry wolf. So back to the deceased, Danny. As his body laid awaiting funeral in the wooden shack, he was guarded by a young man named William or Willie. Willie was a good friend of my grandfather's, and it was his job to keep the body protected. As he sat in the dimly lit shanty guarding the body, to his horror, he heard low, deep growls and something large circling the shack. Willie could smell it instantly and knew instinctively that it was the Hauncas. He could smell rotting flesh and musty animal hair.
Sure.
Holding his rifle tight, he stands up and readies himself for this creature to burst through the door. He says a quick Creek prayer of protection over the dead and cocks his rifle. Willie then hears the sound of hot, heavy breath from above. He quickly looks up, and as the foggy window clears, he sees the Hauncas' evil, intense, bloodshot eyes looking directly at him. His blood turns cold. He explained that the creature was on its hind legs. That means it must have been over 12 feet tall. Willie said he couldn't look away because he was literally paralyzed in fear. After a few minutes, it felt like an eternity, the creature got back on all fours, circled the shack a few more times, and then finally left. Willie did not move 1 inch and stood in the same spot until the sun came up. He knew morning meant safety because the Hauncas were nocturnal. The body of Danny was burned that day in a traditional Creek native funeral ceremony. The reason that most think it is wise to burn the body of a loved one is so that the spirit can rise within the smoke. My dad said he thought it was also that the Hauncas could then not feed upon them. My father said that Willie told my grandfather and everyone he met this story of his terrifying meeting with this creature. He was so proud he protected Danny from the dead, flesh-eating Hauncas and allowed for a decent ceremony for the family. Until 2 weeks later, Willie suddenly dies. Being a young man barely in his 20s, most folks believed it was because he had locked eyes with long ears. My grandfather then volunteered to watch over the body of his friend, and when the Hauncas came again calling, round and round it circled until it stopped just under the window. My grandfather said he felt its glowing red eyes on him, and the hairs stood up on the back of his neck. My grandfather never made the mistake of looking up at the window. He just held steady and kept his eyes forward until morning. It was one very, very long night. The story of the Hauncas was one of a few very remarkable stories told to me as a child, and to this day, whenever I watch a movie with werewolves or wolf-like creatures, I feel a tinge of fear creep up my back. My dad used to say, keep your eyes forward in life, or the Hauncas booger bear will get you. A good Creek scary story always welcomes any discussion or added response. P.S. I have other ghost stories of my own to share, and more Creek myths, like the deer woman, who she calls the deer lady to be respectful. In this particular deer story, she says there's lots of pictures online, so I'm hoping that Susie will submit her story of the deer lady or the deer woman.
Yes.
She says, this was very fun sharing my story. Good memories, blessings, my friend. What do you think of the Hauncas?
It's such a good story on so many levels.
I know. Wasn't she great?
Yeah.
Thank you, Susie. Susie Anderson-Taylor. Woohoo!
Yeah, well done.
Thank you so much. And you know, being around the campfire, being little, hearing a story of a large 12 feet wolf.
Slightly decomposing wolf.
Well, yeah, it's eating the flesh of the dead. And it is also, it's coming back for maybe more food, because the more people it locks eyes with, the more people that
that's
dies.
what moves it between being carrion and just eating flesh that happens to be dead, and being more parasitic, because it's actually attaching and then creating its own food. So it's very proactive in that.
Only in the dark, and only the sun rising does it cause the Hauncas, Hauncas, I believe, to stay away.
It's
So
fascinating.
all of these stories, the Yeth hounds, for those who haven't heard that episode, can you give us a brief? They're on the moors, aren't they?
They're on there are lots of story on the moors, the high ground, the more remote areas.
Yes.
But what is common to these stories, which go back to Celtic mythology, the Nordic legends, to Anglo and Saxon mythologies, is the eyes. It seems to be that it's not just they are large, because if you remember the man who died several years ago, I mean in the 1990s, after seeing one within a few days, it's two aspects. You die within a couple of weeks if you make eye contact.
Yes.
Now the eyes are what are often described, I've heard them as being blood red, but it's the gaze which is important.
Yes.
And dying within a set amount of time, which seems to be within 14 days. Now, this is universal, so we've got this across England, Ireland, Norway, Europe, North America. We probably find that you'd have the same stories in other parts of the world, but we certainly have unrelated cultures telling these stories of this gaze of these wolf animals.
These nocturnal wolves that apparently are of a darker energy. This one eats the flesh of the dead.
Because wolves traditionally have, I believe, have green fire. That's the energy of the wolf. The eyes of the wolf have green fire, and that's the power of life, the energy of life itself. So the wolf itself is not a bad animal. It has the green fire.
But these
in
are
the
different.
eyes.
They're big, black.
These are the opposite. These are sort of parasitic, malicious, dark energies.
I wonder what there is to them. Different names, different cultures.
Different across the world, these things are happening.
It's like the pyramids. It's kind of too close of a coincidence to be a coincidence. It's not a coincidence. So what are they?
What are they?
What is the real name for them? I
Are
guess.
they some kind
Do
of
we know?
super energy, or almost are they some form of elemental force in the way the fairies are, but a larger, darker version of these things which keep cropping up, the fairy folk, etc. The little
big
people.
bad wolf.
The big bad wolf. It's almost like, is it an elemental force which societies have created, which is almost something which is fundamental to the planet, but people have interpreted in different cultural ways. However, that interpretation does seem to remain constant, and it is the wolf.
Yes, feeding off of the earthly dark energy, something like that, and taking the shape of this big large dog or big large wolf. It's really usually the wolf. There's were-dogs too, and did you know that there are were-cats?
Oh, we got one. Where's he gone?
No, it's true. It's true. I know, where is our
People turn
were-cat?
into cats.
Yes.
When they lie around and just lick their, and just have fleas and vomit on the floor.
Lick their balls,
Yeah.
and they just sit around and do their thing, and lick their butts.
Sleep. So you just sleep though. If anything like our cats, you became a werecat. You're like, oh, I became a cat last night and I slept.
The were name in werewolf, were-cat, you know, the were means man.
Yeah.
Man. That's an old English term for
were, the were.
were, W-E-R or whatever. So that means man-wolf, man-cat, man-something, meaning that there's some kind of a human energy.
Yeah.
Maybe. It could be human. It could be a human spirit. I don't know.
So if you get scratched by a cat, you could turn into a werecat.
You probably could. I bet you there's stories like that. Cat scratch fever. It's called lycanthropy, I think. I don't know if I'm saying it right, but that's Zeus getting angry with someone and turning them into a wolf, and then it started from there. So who knows? There's got to be something there.
But it's very interesting that we have tribal people through tribal traditions having the same story.
Yes, and they're not using the internet. So where is it coming from? Has to have some substance. We have another listener submission. Pixie Lewis submitted another story. This is about Ouija boards. So I wanted
please,
to...
yeah.
Yes. Again, if you have a story, we are looking for your stories, especially as we're in the month of October. This is a big month for ghost stories, for otherworldly, for paranormal happenings. There's lots of podcasts out there. But hey, you know what? It's not about being better than those guys. We're all up there with you. We want to share history, folklore, and facts, and stuff like the Hauncas. That's perfect. And this is Pixie's story from Dartmouth. She lives in Dartmouth, and she's one of our newer listeners, and she has written a story about Ouija Board Bill. Ouija Board Bill. Okay, do you know where Acton is in London?
Yeah, it's in West London.
Okay. Yeah. Pixie was 17 years old and lived in West London, Acton. At this time, she says, I moved into my own flat. My sister Leah, aged 15, decided one night, being silly and young, it would be a laugh to do a Ouija board in my living room. Now, I was reluctant and I said no, due to a year earlier having my own very frightening ghostly encounter. But my best friend Samantha really wanted to try and communicate with her father, who sadly passed away. And I could see it was very important to my friend. So they talked me around, and I was not happy about it, but I went along with it. We made and cut out the letters, numbers, and the words yes and no, hello and goodbye. We closed the curtains, lit some candles, and sat in a circle with one finger placed on a small glass. We began. We asked lots of questions. Then we asked if anyone was in the room, anyone who wanted to communicate, and the glass started moving and spelled out the name Bill. I was sure it was Leah moving the glass, joking around, and I told her to stop. I blindfolded her so she couldn't try and trick us. We carried on and asked Bill, how old were you when you passed away? The answer came in, 49. Samantha and I looked at each other in shock. How did you die? We asked. A sudden death was the reply. What year did you die? 2004 was the reply. It was 2004 at the time. I then looked at the glass. And this is interesting, husband. I looked at the glass. It wasn't just moving from left to right across the numbers. It was turning at the same time that it was moving. Yes, it is, because if
you wouldn't be able to turn it; it would fall over.
You couldn't. This is one of the best Ouija board stories I've ever heard, because the way she describes, you got the planchette doesn't spin.
Yeah.
If you got the game, but if you have this little glass,
that is turning.
It was spinning.
The energy inside the glass is.
It's turning of the glass around the glass. It was turning it around as it moved over the letters. So this is a very, very, very important part of the story. So it was moving around and around at the same time. So with one finger placed on the glass, it was impossible for any of us to be moving the glass in a circular motion and hitting those letters. Samantha then felt a presence behind her, and it scared her so much that we decided to stop the game. We didn't ask Bill if he wanted to stop the game, which I understand you are always supposed to do. You're supposed to ask the spirit when talking, when using a talking board. It's supposedly a rule of Ouija. Later that night, my friend and I were sleeping, and in the early hours of the morning, we awoke to hear someone or something knocking on my flat door. I had just moved in, and only my family knew my address, so it was very strange and disturbing. Knock, knock, knock. We heard it again. We both walked to the door to answer it, and nobody was there. This wasn't the front door, but the communal door, and you need a key to get into this door, which is creepy. The only other neighbor lived above, and it definitely wasn't him, as I asked him the next day. The whole thing was just weird. So about 6 years later, I've forgotten about that night. I really don't think about it. We were just silly teenage girls having a laugh, as you do. Then one day I got home and realized I had lost my keys. I phoned my dad to drop off my spare set. I sat at the door and waited for him, and while waiting, a lady who was entering her home next door started a friendly conversation. I explained I was locked out. I never really spoke to her much, apart from hello and goodbye. And as we spoke, she shared with me a little about her life and the news that her partner had been murdered several years ago. His name was Bill, and he was killed during an assault. I felt sad for her and expressed my sympathy and concern, and later that night when I was in bed, I remembered suddenly the spirit Bill. From that night, we made the talking board, and it was unreal. It seemed too much to be a coincidence. So could this have been Bill that we communicated with the spinning glass and all that? She writes, I will never know.
Interesting, isn't it? I mean, no one would ever know, but there is that coincidence. If it is just happened to be a coincidence, or if it is related to that bill, we don't know.
Yep. How are you going to go get validation? Where are you going to get validation from?
Well, yeah, but the board, I suppose. But then you wouldn't want to re-enter that. But it's also that thing about, well, if you even are going to consider doing them, you do have to very carefully and deliberately close them in about 3 different ways, I understand, not just say no. It's a bit like if with certain computer aspects, you do need to make sure that you close programs down.
Well, that's true. That's the thing, is that we've talked about that, is about communication, like leaving the mic on, for where we're at my home studio, of leaving the mic on and going away.
Yeah.
And then saying, if you're there, communicate with us. Other people have said, oh, don't do that, because you got to be careful. Because there was that one woman, I don't remember the story, but she left the recorder on in her kitchen and said, oh, if you're there, talk to me. And then she left, and then she came back and she heard this horrible murder sound or something. Maybe that could be an urban legend, I'm not sure, but she heard this screaming.
It might be. I don't know if that one is. I've heard that. I don't know if it's an urban legend or not. I can't remember where the story comes from. So it could be. It sounds like it could be true.
It could be.
It also sounds very urban legend-like.
Well, some people have advised. I always say, be very careful. Blah blah blah. It's a game. It can't hurt anybody, but it can open the door to other things. Like, I guess if you think of a lethal weapon, say you have a lethal weapon like a gun and you give it to somebody, kids.
Or a bread knife.
Or a bread knife, you give it to kids. Yeah. You don't give it to kids who are just like, hey, is there anybody out there to swing it around? You kind of got to know what you're doing, because there are some people that use these talking communication things like scrying mirror or the crystal ball or other things, ways of communication that apparently they know what they're doing and they are able to navigate into the astral realm.
But even
safely.
people who claim they have control, like Dr. D, it started in the end to tear him apart. It was bad news for Dr. D. And he was the one who was really very into scrying.
For those who don't know Dr. D, 007, this is Queen Elizabeth's second-hand man. Yeah. He's his lead astrologer, I guess.
Her astrologer.
But he's more than just an astrologer. He's an amazing mathematician. And they even, along with, what was his name? Kelly was his last name. They came up with their own language backwards. They were communicating with these spirits or other intelligences.
Language.
Yeah.
Enochian.
Yeah, Enoch, the language of Enoch. So how can they do that? How could that be done?
We might want to do a thing on the D and Kelly another time. It might be an interesting...
maybe.
Yeah. Maybe. Black Mirror, scribing Kelly.
Yeah. If you
Dark
have any,
Angels.
If you have any stories about your own experiences with any reflective surface, they say either water, because they say that's very conducive.
I think the Romans used to scribe with a bowl and water.
Yeah, bowl and water. And what you see, and the reflection... Yeah.
You need to stare at the candle, because that's where the eye goes.
And that gets you to, I guess, relax your awareness of the surroundings. And I guess as your eyes get lazy and you kind of go into that lull, you then begin to see reflections of things in the reflection of the water or the globe or the scrying mirror.
Yeah.
Be careful. Be careful what you wish for.
Whatever you decide to... I mean, any of these aspects of communication are all very, very, should be taken very seriously, even if done at all, because you are communicating with other realms, other forces.
That's true. Be careful that you leave the door open. But the good thing was, you mentioned like the bread knife. Bread knife can be used properly by people who know what's happening. But if you hand it to a bunch of teenagers throwing it around, or young preteens, I don't know. I'm not sure.
Highly
Talking board. There's a guy who literally, he has like a master's degree in the talking board, in the Ouija and the Ouija. And he says, no, it's not harmful unless you have intentions.
Yeah, there are other people that have done research and have said it could be harmful for 2 reasons. One, because psychologically it can be damaging. And secondly, because the theory of things that can come in. And there is that case of, we won't say the name, but a supposed demon that has been reported tens of thousands of times with that name coming up. And people didn't know that name, but they've all come forward with that name.
That is really creepy. It
is creepy, and I wouldn't I wouldn't say the name. But so I think they can be very dangerous.
They say that there are lots of entities that don't have your best interest at heart.
Yes.
That are not far away. And if you invite them in, well, then you've been warned.
Yeah.
So I know you wanted to tell us last week about the Paris Catacombs, yeah?
Oh, yeah. It was just finishing off that story, really.
Yeah.
It was just that it was one place I actually decided I chickened out. I didn't go into the
You did not?
I did so.
Why?
Well, it was just so creepy. I mean, the Paris Catacombs, for those who don't know, are an amazing series of... It's an amazing environment. What happened is that the stone for the building of Paris for centuries had been quarried or mined underneath the city and brought up. So we have this amazing labyrinth of tunnels. Now, in the 1780s, it was decided that Paris just needed to do something about the decomposing bodies that were in the city. The city hadn't got burial space, and these bodies were just filling up the graveyards, and they were just polluting the water supply. This was the main thing, because when it rained a lot, all the gunk from the graveyards, all the body liquor was running into the city's water supply and killing half the population, which is putting even more bodies into the graveyard. So it was a really nasty circle.
God about that.
So it was decided by the authorities that they would remove the bodies, all of the bodies, or the ones they could get their hands on at least. And in 1786, they started to convert the existing tunnels and quarries and caves underneath Paris into a series of catacombs. And in 1 year, it was estimated that they removed from existing burial ground to the catacombs, or moved rather, 7 million bodies.
Jeepers.
And it was said under the cover of darkness every night in every part of Paris, there were long trails of chanting priests who were walking through the streets with burning torches, chanting prayers as they took the bodies on carts to the entrances to the catacombs. But they had to have people behind the carts because they were just heaping them up. And of course, most of these bodies were just decomposing. So all the arms and legs and general heads and limbs are falling off.
Oh, my
and
God.
they had to have the catchers, and they'd have to throw the limbs back onto the carts.
Who gets to do that?
The body catchers.
I guess you need to.
Yes, it was a
job
really
security.
gruesome. But they managed to do it in a year, and it helped the health of Paris.
Whew.
So they dumped millions of bodies into this great dark pit underneath the city. It's massive. It's said there are more miles of catacomb and tunnel underneath central Paris, because Paris itself is a relatively small area. It's like London, the city of London. Inside what we know as Paris, real Paris, is an area which is relatively small.
There's we, not we.
Yeah, we. So there are miles and miles of these catacombs. None of them are properly mapped. Now, the deepest, some of them are quite close to the surface, at about 20 or 30 feet. The deepest run at 300 feet under the surface.
How'd they do that back then?
Well, they were just mining. I mean, you could always mine. People have mined for thousands of years.
Yeah, but you had to have candles.
Yeah, but
That's hard.
they'd mined on a large scale for the stone, so they were existing. It said 7 layers of tunnels. So there is an absolute labyrinth of 7 layers of tunnel.
That's crazy. And perfect for horrifying people.
Absolutely. I mean, there was a movie a couple of years ago, As Above, So Below, and that they used it because there is a legend that the catacombs also conceal the gates to hell.
Yeah.
And there are lots of stories of strange and unexplainable things happening down there. And it's probably because there is a lot of energy down there from those remains, and we don't know what's going on. And it's very, very easy to get lost. In the early 19th century, a barman went down, and he went down, I think, to basically grab some wine.
By himself?
Yeah. So he went to help himself to some wine. Because a lot of houses at the time would have had access. And you can access this from a number of places all over Paris. It's now sealed, and the police take it very seriously, the sealing and the authorities. But at the time, he went down from the cellars of where he was, and he got lost.
Oh, my God.
It was 11 years later when they found his body. But it's said there are many, many people down there who have been lost over the centuries who they have not found their bodies.
Tunnel after tunnel.
And of course, it's full of bones anyway, so you wouldn't even notice if they found a body.
That one looks new.
Yeah.
Well,
It'll be, oh, look there, that one. So
there's Bob.
Yeah, like hiding a book in a library.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
And there was a famous piece of footage which arose, maybe I think it was about 10 or 20 years ago now, of a supposed found camera in the catacombs. And it seems to be someone who, at the end of it, he drops it and they just run off. But he's being chased by something.
And this is something you can find online. I can't remember what it's called. But there are also the cat, what are they called now? I'm trying to remember what they're called. The cat files. Now, the cat files, not the TV program from the 80s, but the cat files are the people that actually go down. It's their hobby to go down. And they even have parties down there.
What?
So they go down into catacombs and they have these kind of parties. And at these events, there are reporting of strange events happening too. Phenomena that can't be explained. But it also could be what they're on when they go to these parties.
Does Oingo Boingo translate? Do you know who Oingo Boingo is?
No.
Never mind. They have a song called Dead Man's Party, but it's not
Anyway,
important.
Dead Man's
Go on.
Party.
Yes, yes.
Because they go down into the catacombs and they party amongst the bones. Really macabre. It's a gothic amped up to its
Well, it would be
ultimate
super
degree.
gothic, yeah.
So you go down into these caves which have been there for some of them for thousands of years, if
Would
not
be
hundreds
really
of years.
Food
with
for thought.
7 million bodies scattered over the floor.
Yeah.
And you're in this labyrinth of this undercity underneath Paris. That they will also go down because they just go down because it's a fascinating
romantically
world.
gothic.
Also, there's an Anne Rice book. I can't remember which one. Is it Lestat? And the vampires are existing, and this is where the vampires exist.
It's a good place for them because no one's going to find them. And people say you
it's
look
one
like
of those Anne Rice.
people say you look like Lestat in your picture.
Do
Your
they?
hair, yeah, how handsome you are. They said
there we go.
they said you would have made a better Lestat than Cruz. So,
Yeah, sharper teeth.
well, I guess so. Let me see those teeth. Yeah,
They go
very
back to the
handsome.
werewolf.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, did anybody ever say that when you had your hair long like that? When you
But you
dressed
look like a vampire.
No, that you because you dressed in period clothing and it's beautiful long hair. Anybody ever say Lestat? Or was that a
No,
little bit later?
because I think
You cut it by then?
because I grown my hair in the mid '80s when it was trendy.
Oh, so you
have
did
long-
it first. They modeled Lestat after you.
Probably. So anyway, so it was a place I refused to go with my students.
Why
I
would you
was
do
too
that? You're already
scared.
there. Why would you say no?
Well,
Seriously, what were you scared of?
I think it was claustrophobia too. I just thought when I'm down there, I'm going to feel stuck. And if I don't like it, and I've watched a number of films on YouTube, and it does look claustrophobic with all those bodies piled up. Because what would happen is when I have my students, I would say, I'd come up with a good idea. Like, it wasn't always educationally based. It was like, I know, let's all go, blah, blah. So, and then I bottled out on this one. So the next year, I had to take them to an even more gruesome place, just to make up. I went to the Ossuaria of Kutnohora in the Czech Republic.
What's that?
That is a church that is made of the remains of 70,000 people. What happened is, just very briefly, in the Middle Ages, there was a small religious order in this place, and they decided they want to become larger and become more important. So one of the, I don't know if it was a monk or a priest, went off to the Holy Land, got several barrels of soil from Jerusalem and scattered it over this area, and then marketed it very well in I think it's around 1270, 1280, as a place you could be buried in holy ground. You don't have to go to Jerusalem. We got buried.
We brought Jerusalem to you.
We brought Jerusalem to you. And so this became a really, really, really popular place to be buried.
It's good marketing.
But they had too many bodies. At one point, there was a semi-blind monk, I know, and his job was just to go around for the whole of his career as a monk, if that's the right way of putting it, just picking up the bones all the time, putting it into a cart and taking it to the church. So the church became absolutely piled thick with, I mean, it's done very systematically, thigh bones piled, skulls piled. In the 1870s, the local carpenter was taken on to do something with it. So he used the human remains to build the entire interior structure of the church.
He used them as building material.
Yes.
Smart. Kind of.
Very smart.
And creepy.
Very creepy.
Yeah.
So he made chairs of the thigh bones. He made great chandeliers just using jawbones.
That's weird.
The finger bones are used as drops.
Oh, wow.
And everything is made of human bones. I mean, I don't even sit on these chairs, I don't think, unless there's a wooden structure underneath. I didn't try. And then there's these lung tunnels, and you just look down, and it's just like a scene from the Holocaust. It's just like skulls piled on top of one another from ceiling really high, and tens of thousands of thigh bones all piled up from ceiling to floor. And every tunnel you look down, it's just bones. And everything's made of bone. So all you're aware of is your own mortality. When we went in, I went with my students, and we were all fascinated. It's like, oh my God, this is so gothic. But we got quieter and quieter, and after about 10 minutes, we just started to trickle out, and none of us could bear it. But we were covered in that dust. We were covered in, I suppose it would be bone dust. The only time I had an experience that was a bit like that was just after 9/11 and being in Lower Manhattan, when you had that dust, and it was like you felt the dust was a sign of mortality. It was exactly the same. That dust was mortality. It was a reminder of life and death.
Well, it would be, because in the Western world we hide it. You don't see it.
Yeah.
You don't get to see, not like it was just a matter of 100 years ago. It was even, well, in other cultures now, too, in India, like you said.
Yeah, in India.
We just don't see it, and it's a forbidden sight to see, but also heaped upon heaped upon heaped.
The volume into one small claustrophobic space. The windows aren't great, they're high, it's not that light, but it's just the space. It's the fact everything is made of bone. It's just truly gruesome.
It would be something to do a psychological experiment of people that are just, I just want something to see. We're out here to see it, and then see what happens and takes place in the interior.
Well, I was doing that because, I got my education head on in a way, because, I went in to see it and it was fascinating, but we're also using it because we're using it in our own work, and we were doing work on mortality. So it related to work we were doing. So students had like reading lists and stuff like that. So it was actually got a sound educational basis. But I was actually watching the students and how they reacted to this space. And they all went in like, ha, 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 like big groups of them. He's jolly, ha, ha, the boys being a bit more bravado from the girls, who are a bit more, you can imagine the kind of stuff. Like 18 to 21-year-olds mostly. It changed. And that bravado and that went, and people became very quiet. And also I noticed that people kind of went away from big groups. They would be in a group of 2, then they go and be with somebody else. So people were needing to be with people, but not in big groups. And there was a very strange dynamic to how people were operating in that space.
I'd like to take a look at that sometime, to take a look and see what that would do, to see so much of the human physical body on display of after death. Each one of those, a fetus growing into adulthood, and each one of those representing a loss, a death, and all that, rather than being under the ground or in a mausoleum or cremated, to actually see the bones themselves, what that does to the human psyche.
Absolutely. It wasn't a killing ground. It wasn't like going to Cambodia or Auschwitz or somewhere that hadn't got that. People had just died, and it's where their remains were.
Still.
But it was still very much the concept of mortality.
That's really, really something to chomp on.
The gruesomeness of it.
We are moving closer towards Halloween, and we also need your help because we need more ghost stories to come in. Hopefully Susie will submit her lady,
oh yes, please, Susie.
The Deer Lady.
The Deer Lady.
Hopefully she'll submit that, and we're looking forward to more stories from you. The ways to do it are hit us up at our website, which is www.storiesfromthestandingroom.com. You can also find us on facebook.com/Stories from the Standing Room. Twitter, you can tweet your story to us in a message. You can also attach it in a private message at Stories from the Standing Room. A lot of them are coming on that way because we were born on Facebook. Facebook Live is what created, it wasn't the sole creation, but it was part of the creation of this show. We were born because of Facebook Live, and now we've moved into full podcast mode. And podcasting has just taken off huge. It's massive now. So this is a very crowded place that we're in, which is paranormal stories and podcasting. But we have our little angle is history, folklore, facts, fun, and ghostly ghastliness. Ghastly ghostliness. A little bit. The stories, yeah?
Yeah.
Are you thinking of the bones?
There are these local village ladies, and they charge you like really very little. This is just only after the wall had come down, so they were really just still within. They'd been living in with a sort of communist system, and they charged a few pennies to go in. But they were all kind of strange and all in black with headscarves, and I was just staring. It was just very spooky. I think they were as spooky as the contents in a way. They were not used to that many at that point, that many visitors, because it would still just come from outside the Iron Curtains. So.
Well, also, if it's super new like that, they're just charging admission. There's really not a lot of health and safety on the inside.
Really.
Not really a lot of...
I was surprised that no one decided to bring anything home with them. And I'm also thinking that we're going to go and see, talking about the Deer Lady, we'll be going to the Lady of the Lake.
We are going to Glastonbury this week.
Which is at the Isle of Avalon.
Yes, and the legend of the Lady in the Lake holding up the sword.
As Excalibur is thrown into the lake or the marsh below the door.
We are headed up there, and we need to gather more ghost stories, so we will come back with episode 17 next week. Submit your stories, please. Also, you can submit them via MP3 on your smartphone. It is super easy. Just go to the record feature on your phone. The quality is extremely, surprisingly good. And send that along in an email, and we will feature you telling your own story of paranormal or perhaps
ghoulish general.
Yeah, ghostliness.
And general ghoulishness.
Yes. So thank you very much for joining us. We love you very much, and we will see you again.
Thank you.
Next week on
you next
Stories from the Standing Room.
Always saying the Scooby-Doo. Oh dear.
Perfect. All right. We'll see you next week. We love you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.